Okay, so you've sent over some really compelling material about the Cold War, and today we're going to dive into that, specifically focusing on, what it was actually like living with that constant nuclear threat hanging over everything.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, but fascinating.
Absolutely. And our goal here, our sort of mission, isn't just to list facts, but to really pull out the key insights, maybe some things people don't often think about, and understand the sheer weight of that time
Yeah.
without getting totally bogged down in dates and treaties.
Right, cutting through the noise to get to the core experience.
Exactly. Because at its heart, the Cold War was this huge standoff, wasn't it? This ideological clash, capitalism, democracy versus communism, state control.
A fundamental conflict of worldviews.
And the sources make it clear this wasn't just abstract politics happening far away. It shaped everyday life for a whole generation.
That's spot on. What's really striking is how this massive geopolitical struggle just permeated everything. It wasn't just news headlines.
No.
It was in schools, in communities, people building bomb shelters in their backyards.
Yeah.
It was a very tangible reality for millions.
Yeah, reading through this material, that pervasive fear just leaps off the page. It wasn't like a background hum. It was, well, woven into the fabric of daily life. Things that seem almost bizarre now, these duck and cover drills you mentioned,
Yeah.
kids hiding under desks, air raid sirens being tested regularly.
Can you imagine? Thinking a school desk would help.
It's quite sobering, isn't it, to think about living with that constant, one source called it a grim knowledge, just always there.
It really underscores the psychological burden.
Yeah.
And connecting that to the bigger picture, this relentless arms race, it led to mad mutually assured destruction,
Right.
which is this incredibly bizarre concept stability to the certainty of total annihilation if anyone blinked.
A terrifying kind of stability.
Exactly. And it meant the potential for, a catastrophic mistake and miscalculation was always lurking.
And it's right against that backdrop, that constant thread, that we get the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. Suddenly that abstract fear felt incredibly real, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. For 13 days, the world was, genuinely on the precipice.
So maybe paint a picture for us. Why was that specific crisis, that confrontation, just so incredibly dangerous? What made it the flashpoint?
Well, there's the obvious geographical bit, of course. Soviet missiles, nuclear missiles, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Yeah, that's close.
It dramatically cut down warning times, made the threat feel immediate, visceral. But it was also the very direct, very personal standoff between Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Right. The leaders themselves.
Kennedy's public ultimatum, get those missiles out, combined with all this frantic, high-stakes diplomacy happening behind the scenes, secret back-channeling.
Look, unbelievably tense.
Like a high-stakes poker game with the worst possible consequences.
Pretty much. Both leaders trying to project strength without, accidentally triggering Armageddon. And ultimately, Khrushchev blinked. He agreed to remove the missiles. A strategic retreat, perhaps, but one that pulled everyone back from the brink.
It averted what many, many people at the time thought was inevitable nuclear war.
It's almost hard to grasp how close it came. The sources really highlight Kennedy's role, that mix of being firm, but also keeping lines of communication open.
Crucial.
And Khrushchev's willingness in the end to withdraw. It feels like this convergence of, immense pressure, but also just enough rational thinking on both sides, maybe.
I think that's fair. And that's why it's still studied so intensely today, isn't it, in international relations? It's this stark lesson about the dangers of miscalculation, of misreading the other side when the stakes are existential. It showed how vital clear communication is, even unofficial channels, and trying to understand your adversary's motives, however alien they might seem.
A brutal lesson in managing power in the nuclear age.
Definitely.
So the Cold War obviously went on for decades after Cuba, and the key players changed. The texture of the tension seemed to evolve too, didn't it?
It did. That early, almost personal animosity between JFK and Khrushchev, it shifted.
And then later in the 80s, you get Reagan and Gorbachev. A very different era, a different dynamic.
A really significant shift.
Yeah.
Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars as it got nicknamed, that's a fascinating piece of this later period.
Right, the space lasers idea, basically, a shield in space.
Sort of, yeah. A proposed space-based system to shoot down incoming Soviet missiles.
Yeah.
The idea was to, make nuclear war unwinnable for them, or at least make their arsenal less effective.
Which must have looked incredibly provocative, destabilizing from the Soviet point of view.
Oh, it absolutely did. They saw it as a potential game changer, something that could potentially negate their entire nuclear deterrent.
Hmm.
But looking back, SDI also, perhaps unintentionally, opened up new avenues for talks.
Hmm.
The sheer technological hurdles, the astronomical costs involved,
Hmm.
it kind of highlighted the limits of just endlessly escalating. It maybe made serious arms control talk seem, well, more necessary, more appealing to both sides.
And then, kind of alongside this, you have Gorbachev rising to power in the Soviet Union.
Yes, and that's absolutely pivotal. His introduction of glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost openness, perestroika restructuring, these were fundamental shifts within the Soviet system itself, right?
Exactly. And that's what's so remarkable. These internal reforms, driven by, deep economic problems and a desire for more transparency within the USSR, they ended up undermining the whole ideological basis of the Cold War rivalry.
How so?
Well, Gorbachev started engaging more openly with the West. And crucially, he loosened Moscow's grip on the Eastern European satellite states.
The Warsaw Pact countries.
Right. And once that happened, it was like a domino effect. Poland, Hungary, East Germany. One after another, they started asserting their independence. The Berlin Wall came
A
down.
huge symbolic moment.
Massive.
Yeah.
And all this led, fairly rapidly actually, to the dismantling of the Soviet bloc and then ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1991.
And it happened relatively peacefully, considering the decades of tension and the nuclear arsenals involved.
Which is perhaps the most remarkable part. An end to this decades-long standoff that had held the entire planet hostage, essentially.
It really is extraordinary when you think back to the sheer tension of, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, shifting gears slightly, the sources mention some, let's call them quirkier or maybe just less well-known aspects. Operation Northwoods, that definitely caught my eye. What was that about?
Yeah, that one is sobering.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the kind of thinking that can happen in periods of intense conflict.
Okay.
Operation Northwoods was a real proposal, top secret at the time, obviously, put forward by sections of the U.S. military in the early 60s.
A proposal for what?
For the U.S. military to stage fake false flag terrorist attacks on American soil against U.S. military and civilian targets.
Wow. Seriously.
Seriously. Detailed plans, things like blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay, staging plane hijackings, even orchestrating violent incidents in American cities. And the idea was to blame it all convincingly on Cuba.
As a pretext to invade.
Exactly. As a justification for a full-scale U.S. military intervention in Cuba. What's truly astonishing is that this wasn't just some vague idea. It was a fully drafted plan presented to the Kennedy administration.
Kennedy.
He rejected it, flat out.
Yeah.
Which is, fortunate. But the very fact that it was conceived and developed to that level, it's a chilling glimpse into the paranoia, the deep distrust, the extreme measures being considered in some quarters back then.
Genuinely unsettling. It really highlights the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. On a perhaps slightly lighter note, but still related to that atmosphere, a cultural side. The sources mention the boom in spy novels, spy movies.
Oh, yeah, Bond, James Bond, but also Le Carré and countless others.
Right. It feels like that whole genre just exploded during the Cold War.
It really did.
Yeah.
And if you connect that to the underlying anxieties, it makes sense, doesn't it? This shadowy world of espionage, secrets, double agents, the constant East-West struggle. It captured the public imagination.
It was a way to process the uncertainty.
I think so. It tapped into those fears, but also the fascination with this hidden world that was shaping global events. It wasn't just escapism. It was reflecting something very real about the times. It became this dominant cultural theme.
So for you listening to this, if you're interested in digging deeper into this era, the sources actually offer some really good starting points, some interesting angles.
Yeah, they point towards primary sources, for instance, like reading memoirs from the political figures involved, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Reagan, Gorbachev, to get those firsthand accounts.
Right, get inside their heads a bit.
Or looking at declassified documents. Sometimes dry, maybe, but they can reveal so much about the actual decision-making, the intelligence assessments, what was really going on behind the scenes.
That's where things like Operation Northwoods eventually come to light, I suppose.
Exactly. And another interesting angle mentioned is cultural diplomacy.
How things like music, art, even sports tours.
Yeah, how those exchanges, sometimes subtle, sometimes more overt, might have played a role. Maybe easing tensions slightly, maybe building tiny bridges between people, even while governments were at odds.
It suggests the Cold War wasn't just military and politics then.
Not at all. It was multifaceted.
Yeah.
And these cultural connections, even if small, could sometimes you know, humanize the enemy a little bit, open up small channels.
And of course, the technological angle. The arms race itself drove huge innovation.
Absolutely massive. Computing, satellites, materials, science. So many advancements that we still benefit from today have their roots, directly or indirectly, in that Cold War competition.
It's a complicated legacy. And a crucial point made is that the core concept of nuclear deterrence, which really solidified back then, well, it's still very much with us, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. The strategies, the risks, the sheer existence of these weapons, it remains a central feature of global politics. Understanding how deterrence worked or didn't work during the Cold War is incredibly relevant to today's world.
So the Cold War isn't just history, its dynamics are still playing out.
In many ways, yes. The specific U.S.-Soviet rivalry is gone, but the challenges of managing nuclear arsenals, preventing proliferation, navigating great power competition, those persist. Studying the Cold War, its successes and its failures, offers really valuable context for today's tensions.
The sources also suggest kind of thinking outside the box a bit when looking at this period, going beyond the leaders and the missiles.
Right, like exploring the psychological impact on ordinary people.
Yeah.
What was it actually like growing up doing duck and cover drills, living with that background radiation of fear?
Oral histories, personal stories.
Exactly. They offer a human dimension that you just don't get from policy documents. And also looking at how the era's anxieties seeped into art, into literature, beyond just the spy thrillers.
Reflecting that uncertainty, maybe that sense of absurdity sometimes.
Precisely. Looking at individual experiences, at cultural output, it gives you a much more visceral feel for the time. It moves beyond grand strategy to how it actually felt to live through it. The personal fears, the hopes.
So as we sort of wrap up this deep dive, what do you see as the big takeaway, the most enduring lesson from the Cold War that still holds true today?
I think the most critical lesson, and it comes through again and again in the materials, is just the absolute necessity of dialogue, of diplomacy, of trying, genuinely trying to understand the other side, even when you fundamentally disagree or distrust them.
Communication is key.
It's absolutely vital. The Cold War, for all its dangers, for all the near misses like Cuba, it didn't end in a global nuclear war. And a large part of that was down to persistent communication, even in the tensest moments, strategic thinking, and ultimately some level of restraint on both sides.
Finding ways to manage conflict without catastrophe.
Yes. And in our world today, which is still full of complex, dangerous challenges, that basic lesson, the need for dialogue, for diplomacy, for finding peaceful ways to manage disagreements, it feels more relevant than ever, really.
Well, this has been really illuminating, a journey back into a time of immense, almost unimaginable tension, but one that, as you say, holds really crucial lessons for us now. It leaves me thinking, considering that constant threat, that grim knowledge they lived with for decades, what do you suppose future historians will make of the underlying anxieties of that period? How will they interpret things like the duck and cover drills, Operation Northwoods, the whole cultural obsession with spies? It's certainly food for thought.